This episode is sponsored by Mudwater, a coffee alternative made with a blend of mushrooms, spices, cacao, and herbs. I personally started looking for something that still felt like a morning ritual without having to rely on a ton of coffee. And then I found Mudwater, and honestly, I love it. I love how it fits into my routine. The taste is delicious. It's warm, earthy, slightly spicy, and it just feels cozy. Mudwater is made with functional ingredients like lion's mane and reishi, plus cacao and masala chai spices. And it's designed to actually support focus and your daily rhythm while helping you cut back on caffeine. And bonus for you, my listeners get 20% off their first order when you go to mudwater.com. That's mudwtr.com/why not. So if you're curious about switching up your morning drink or you're just looking for a new coffee alternative, check it out using my link in the show notes. So give Mudwater a try, because why not? Have you ever stopped to think about how absolutely unhinged it is that your entire life runs on numbers in a bank app? Like a glowing rectangle on your phone tells you whether you can eat tonight. You work 40 hours a week, exchange your time, energy, sanity, and in return, you get digital points in a system most people could not explain if their life depended on it. And somehow we're all just collectively like, yeah, that seems fine. Because here's the thing, money only works if everyone agrees that it does. That's it. That's the spell. It's not food, shelter, it's not warmth. You can't drink it. You can't hunt with it. You can't wrap yourself in it when the heat goes out in January. It's just trust. Institutional trust, social trust, government trust, market trust. And for most of modern history, that trust used to be anchored to something very specific. Gold. Yep, gold. Actual metal. Heavy, shiny, locked in vaults, guarded by soldiers. Hidden behind doors so thick they sound like they belong in a Marvel villain lair. And then, one day, that connection quietly went away. No more metal behind your money, just policy, central banks, interest rates, economic models, emergency printing presses, trillions appearing on spreadsheets during crises while the rest of us are just like, I'm sorry, did you just say trillion with a T? Which is why every time inflation spikes, every time the market freaks out, every time a war breaks out, every time a recession whispers your name, people start asking the same questions. Who controls this? Where's the gold? Is it still there? Can they just make more money? And what happens if the whole thing just completely collapses? Because the second money starts feeling fake, the internet starts getting creative. And somewhere in Kentucky, there's a building called Fort Knox that people swear holds the biggest secret of them all. So today, we're talking about the Federal Reserve. We're talking about gold. We're talking about power, paranoia, historical decisions that still haunt people, and the conspiracy ecosystem that blossoms whenever humans feel financially unsafe. So pour a glass, people, because this one's about to get weird. Welcome back to Why Not Talk About It, the podcast where we unpack the world's most chaotic stories, mysteries, cults, conspiracies, crimes, and cultural moments, one glass at a time. I'm Ashley, your wonderful host, and I have wine, I have notes, and I have a hell of a lot of juicy info on central banking. But listen, before anyone panics, this is not an investing podcast. I'm not here to tell you what to buy, sell, bury in your backyard, or hide in some floor safe. This episode is about something much more fun. It's about why people are suddenly obsessed with gold again, why the Federal Reserve makes people twitchy, why inflation sends everyone into a total panic, why a giant government vault has launched more conspiracy theories than Bigfoot, which, as you know, we've talked about, and why every economic downturn produces at least one man on YouTube insisting that the dollar is going to zero by Thursday. We're doing timelines, we're doing presidents making emergency announcements, we're doing mysterious institutions that most of us can't properly define, but somehow run the global financial system. We're doing Fort Knox. Yes, baby, definitely. We're doing Nixon. We're doing shadowy elite lore, because nothing brings people together like the fear that your money might be imaginary. All right, take a sip. Let's start at the very beginning. Before banks, before apps, before dollars, before gold bars and vaults. Back when money was honestly just kind of like vibes, metal, and mutual agreement. All right, so before we get to the, shadowy institutions and locked vaults, we need to talk about what money even is, because spoiler, it has never been as solid or obvious as we pretend. In the beginning, and by beginning I mean ancient civilization era humanity just trying to survive, there was obviously no Venmo, no coins, no paper bills with tiny historical faces judging you from your wallet. There was barter. You have goats, I have grain. You want grain, I want goats. We exchange. Everyone leaves, vaguely satisfied. Except that system falls apart immediately the second, I don't want goats. You already have grain. Your goat is sick. My grain harvest failed. Or I simply just don't trust you, which is kind of the theme of this entire episode. Trust is the whole thing. So humans, being the clever little pattern loving creatures that we are, start gravitating toward objects that are rare enough to be valuable, durable, divisible, portable, and hard to fake. Enter metals: silver, copper, gold. And gold in particular really had a glow up. It doesn't rust, it doesn't corrode, doesn't fall apart. You can melt it and you can shape it. You can even stamp a ruler's face on it and say, this weighs this much and therefore counts as money. And most people will just go along with that as long as the ruler seems powerful and nobody's currently invading. Ancient societies across the world start minting coins. Empires realize very quickly that controlling currency is a great way to control literally everything. Soldiers get paid in it, taxes get collected in it, governments hoard it, merchants trust it. Suddenly gold it's not just shiny, it's political. It's legitimacy and stability. It's the thing that says this empire is real and so is your paycheck, which is where things get interesting. Because even back then, money wasn't already abstracting. The gold coin isn't valuable because you can eat it. It's valuable because everyone around you agrees it's valuable. And because the authority that stamped it has convinced you that they'll still exist tomorrow. Already, we're starting to play a collective imagination game. Now, fast forward a bit. Trade expands, empires fall, new governments pop up, commerce goes international, and lugging around sacks of metal everywhere becomes pretty inconvenient. Like, yes, gold is great. It's beautiful, it's dense, but gold is also extremely heavy, like really heavy. So, what's the workaround? Well, people start storing their precious metals in secure places with goldsmiths, banks, with state treasuries, and in return, they get a paper receipt. Basically, a note that says, hi, yes, hello, you have X amount of gold in our vault. Bring this back later and we'll give it back to you. Those pieces of paper start circulating because instead of hauling bars across town, you can now just hand someone the receipt, which is a huge leap. You're no longer trading the thing itself, you're trading a promise, a claim, a piece of paper that represents metal sitting somewhere you've probably never seen with your own eyes. And at first, that paper is tightly linked to the physical stuff. You could theoretically show up and say, give me my gold, and they're supposed to just hand it over. Keyword supposed to. Because once you realize that most people are never actually coming to claim their gold, and once banks notice that only a fraction of depositors show up at the same time, well, now we're cooking. Now you can issue more receipts than you have metal, as long as nobody panics, as long as confidence holds, and as long as people don't all show up on the same day demanding their bars back. Which is where the first big financial horror story enters the chat: bank runs. If people lose trust, if rumors spread, if a crisis hits, suddenly everyone wants the physical thing now. I want my money and I want it now. Lines form, vaults empty, institutions collapse, and the entire system reveals that it was always built on belief. This is important, so sit with that. From basically the dawn of organized economies, money has not been about intrinsic usefulness. It's been about authority, stability, enforcement, and shared agreement. Gold helped anchor that agreement because it was tangible, heavy, finite. You could point to it and say, that exists. But even then, most people weren't actually interacting with the gold. They were interacting with symbols, coins, notes, ledgers, accounts, those little money receipts, aka the dollar. But already, long before the Federal Reserve, before Fort Knox, before presidents making emergency Sunday night announcements, money had quietly become psychological. It lived in vaults that you would never see, in institutions you just had to trust, in promises made by people in power, which is why centuries later, those promises, they started to feel shaky. When inflation hits, systems change, governments make emergency decisions, when banks wobble, people instinctively reach back for the most ancient financial comfort object humanity ever picked, the shiny gold rock. All right, so now that we know gold didn't just randomly become a thing, let's talk about the era where governments made it official, where your dollar literally used to be a coupon for metal. Because, yes, that was once real, and people are still mad about how that ended. Okay, so now that we've established that money has always been a, group project fueled by trust, let's talk about the era that gold lovers bring up the way some people bring up their, glory days in high school. The gold standard. This is the part where people say things like, back when money was real, back when dollars were actually backed by something, back when governments couldn't just print. And yes, for a long stretch of modern history, that was technically true. Under a gold standard system, paper money wasn't just symbolic, it was redeemable. Your dollar bill was basically a receipt, like we talked about, pretty much like an IOU, if you will. A little paper promise saying this can be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. If you walked into a bank with enough of those slips, in theory, they would open the vault and hand you metal, which is honestly wild to imagine right now, right? I mean, like, excuse me, sir, I would like to withdraw my checking account in bricks. But this system didn't just pop up overnight. Different countries experimented with gold backed currencies in different ways throughout the 1800s, especially as international trade exploded and governments wanted stable exchange rates. Gold became the universal translator. So, if everyone agrees on how much gold is worth, then different currencies suddenly make sense across borders. It brought order and predictability, it made international commerce smoother, but it also made governments extremely nervous. Because the upside of tying your money to gold is discipline. You can't just create unlimited currency. You're constrained by how much metal you physically possess, which sounds comforting until the government grows faster than your gold supply, until people want loans, businesses want to expand, or until a war breaks out, and suddenly the government needs to spend obscene amounts of money very quickly. Gold is finite, but economic crises are not. So, while the gold standard created stability in some ways, it also created serious rigidity. Recessions were harder to fight, banks couldn't easily inject cash into the system, governments couldn't respond flexibly to shocks, economic slowdowns turned into deep freezes, deflation became a threat, basically meaning money grows more valuable over time, which sounds great until nobody wants to spend anything because tomorrow it will be worth more. And then there's the psychology again. Because once people know their paper can be turned into gold, panic takes on a very specific flavor. If rumors start flying, if banks wobble, if a war looms, everyone wants to redeem their notes immediately. Which brings us back to those bank runs. Lines out the door, vaults being drained, institutions collapsing in public view. Governments quickly realize that when confidence breaks, a rigid gold backed system can accelerate disaster instead of containing it. Another thing that made officials itchy, gold moving across borders. I mean, come on, as people, we like to move and we're taking money with us, right? If one country seemed unstable, people could, convert currency into gold and ship it somewhere safer. Suddenly, nations were bleeding reserves. Currencies weakened, political tensions flared, money and geopolitics were already hopelessly entangled. And then there was the political problem. Not every citizen was actually strolling into banks demanding metal. Most people just used the paper, which meant that the system only worked as long as the redemption stayed mostly theoretical. Sound familiar? Because once again, we're dealing with belief, with confidence, with the assumption that the gold is there if you need it, even if you never personally check. By the 1900s, early 1900s, industrial economies were growing faster and becoming more complex than this tight metallic leash could easily handle. Financial crises kept erupting, bank panics kept happening, and lawmakers started asking a very uncomfortable question. What happens when the entire system freezes and we don't have the tools to thaw it? Which is where we quietly start drifting towards centralized control, toward emergency powers, institutions designed to stabilize markets when fear takes over, towards something that can flood the system with cash when everything seizes up, and toward, you guessed it, a central bank. And in the United States, that anxiety boiled over in one spectacular moment that scared the political class so badly it helped birth the most controversial financial institution in American history. All right, so now that we've set up why governments loved and hated gold at the same time, let's talk about the panic that finally pushed them over the edge. Because before the Federal Reserve existed, the US financial system nearly imploded in public. And everyone collectively was like, yeah, we should probably build something for this. All right, so at this point in the story, the United States has money. It has banks, it has paper currency tied at least partially to gold. But what it does not have is a consistent way to stop the entire financial system from spontaneously combusting every few decades. Because through the late 1800s and early 1900s, America's banking world was kind of like a group chat with no moderator. There were thousands of banks, different reserves, limited coordination, and no central authority acting as a lender of last resort, which meant when panic hit, it really hit. Rumors would spread that a bank was shaky. People would sprint to withdraw cash. Those banks would run out of reserves, and that would spook customers at the next bank. Dominoes, just pure dominoes. And these panics weren't subtle. We're talking nationwide freezes in credit, stock markets wobbling, companies unable to make payroll, and politicians getting screamed at by constituents who suddenly couldn't access their own money. I mean, totally valid, right? One of the worst moments came in the early 1900s when a major financial panic rattled Wall Street so hard that private bankers basically had to organize emergency rescue themselves. Like, imagine your economic safety net being a handful of extremely wealthy guys calling each other, like, so are we saving the system? Or, yeah, not ideal. Everyone basically freaked the fuck out. Lawmakers, reformers, business leaders. Everyone agreed on one thing, though. This cannot keep happening. So, Congress starts debating whether the US needs a central banking system, something that could supply emergency liquidity, stabilize banks during panics, regulate parts of the financial system, smooth out boom and bust cycles, and act as the financial firefighter when everything ignites all at once. Sounds reasonable. It also sounds terrifying to a lot of people because Americans had already had a long standing distrust of centralized financial power. Sound familiar? Some things never change. Pretty sure we aren't the problem. The country had fought bitter political battles over national banks in the 1800s, and there was deep suspicion that financiers in big cities were rigging the system against farmers, workers, and small towns. So, the idea of creating a powerful institution that could influence money and credit, that triggered something primal. Cue accusations of elites, fears of manipulation, editorials about democracy being undermined, cue pamphlets, so many pamphlets. Eventually, in the early 1910s, lawmakers strike a compromise and pass legislation creating a new system, not one single monolithic bank, but a weird hybrid. And I mean weird in the most fascinating way. It had a central board in Washington, multiple regional reserve banks spread around the country, a mix of public oversight and private banking participation, leadership appointed by the government, but daily operations insulated from direct political control. Already confusing. Already the kind of structure that makes people go, wait, so who exactly is in charge here? Which, spoiler, is not great for public trust. The new institution is called the Federal Reserve, aka the Fed. Short, clinical, and sounds like something that could absolutely run your life. Its job? To regulate parts of the banking system, to keep money flowing, to respond to crises, to influence interest rates, to try to maintain stable prices and full employment. Emphasis on try. You know, just casual small responsibilities. So, as you can imagine, from the jump, people were side-eyeing it. Some thought it would prevent disasters, others thought it handed too much power to unelected officials, Others worried that it would serve Wall Street more than the ordinary people. And others believed it was a shadowy government inside the government. And here's the thing, the Fed was deliberately designed to be somewhat insulated from public pressure. Because the thinking was, if politicians can directly control the money supply, they might abuse it for short term gains. So, independence was supposed to be a feature, not a bug. But independence also looks a lot like secrecy if you're on the outside. Closed door meetings, complex language, policy statements that read like they were written by people actively trying to not be understood, rate decisions that move global markets, no one voting for these people, and no obvious villain twirling a mustache. Just enormous power exercised quietly, which is exactly the kind of setup that makes conspiracy theorists stretch their legs. And at first, the Fed doesn't magically fix everything. Financial crises still happen, recessions still come, the Great Depression is looming in our future, world wars are coming. The relationship between governments, gold, and central banks is about to get extremely messy. But now, for the first time, the US has a centralized institution that sits at the heart of money itself. And once you put something at the center of the system, everything that goes wrong starts pointing toward it. All right, so now we've got gold backed money, nervous governments, repeated panics, a brand new ultra powerful institution, and a public that's not entirely convinced that everything is fine, which is a perfect setup for what comes next. Because the economy is about to collapse in a spectacular fashion. And the federal government is going to do something with gold that still makes people argue nearly a century later. But before we get to presidents confiscating bullion and lighting the conspiracy fuse, let's detour somewhere that has haunted American imagination for decades. A place that shows up in literally every "what if all the gold is gone" threads, right? A building so famous it basically is a metaphor. Locked, guarded, mysterious, Kentucky based. You know where we're going. Okay, so now we need to talk about a building because there is perhaps no structure in America that has launched more late night forums, TikTok conspiracies, and aggressive comment section debates than Fort Knox. Even saying the name feels dramatic. Fort Knox, right? It sounds fake. It sounds like a superhero's villain's hideout. It sounds like where you would keep an infinity stone or something. But in reality, officially anyway, it's a US Army installation in Kentucky that houses the United States Bullion Depository, the place where people believe holds a massive portion of America's gold reserves. Think heavy gold bars stacked, stamped, and locked behind doors so thick they could probably survive an asteroid. It was built in the 1930s during a time when the government had suddenly accumulated a lot of gold, which, yes, is going to matter later. The location was chosen very deliberately. It's inland, far from coasts, hard to reach, protected by military forces, surrounded by layers of security. There are no public tours, no casual drop ins, no little gift shop where you can buy a souvenir nugget or whatever. It's just fences, guards, and some pretty intense vibes. And the government does periodically say how much gold is stored there. I say like thousands of tons, but it makes it one of the largest known gold reserves on Earth. But here's where the mystique really takes off. Almost nobody gets inside. We're talking extremely limited access. High ranking officials, Treasury employees, the occasional carefully controlled inspection, the press, rarely, politicians, sometimes, random civilians, absolutely not, which is understandable from a security standpoint. But psychologically, it's catnip. Because if you tell the public, like, don't worry, our most valuable national treasure is stored in a sealed building you're never going to see, some percentage of humanity is immediately going to be like, okay, but is it though? So, photos have been released over the years, officials have toured, members of Congress have been invited in very controlled situations. There are reports, serial numbers, whatever, and there are official audits and weigh-ins. But the rumors never stop. People question how often it's inspected, who exactly verifies it, whether the gold has been moved, whether it's been leased, if it was secretly sold, whether the bars are actually tungsten with a thin gold coating. Yes, tungsten core bars are a recurring character in this genre. Every time gold prices spike or inflation hits or politicians start arguing about spending, Fort Knox re-enters the chat. Go check the vault. Show us the bars. Open it. Why is it so secret? Which is understandable. Like, I feel that way. I want to know how much is in there. You know what I mean? But it becomes less a physical place and more of a symbol of national wealth, of trust, of whether governments are being honest, of whether the money is real. A huge chunk of the conspiracy ecosystem around gold and the Federal Reserve uses Fort Knox as Exhibit A. Like, if the gold isn't there, then the whole system is fake, then currencies are lying, then elites know something we don't, then collapse is imminent. You see the slope, and she's steep and very well traveled. But for now, we're just planting the seed, because before we go full Reddit thread at 3 a.m., we actually need to understand how the US government ended up sitting on that much gold in the first place, and why presidents started making extremely aggressive decisions about who could own it. Okay, before we get to the good stuff, we do need a quick history lesson. Sorry about it. And I mean quick, like running through an airport with a rolling suitcase quick. So here's the compressed version. The Great Depression hits in the 1930s, as we know. So banks collapse, people panic, everyone tries to pull their money out all at once. President Franklin D. Roosevelt responds by doing something that still makes people scream on the internet. Americans are ordered to turn in most of their gold to the government. The idea? Stop hoarding, stabilize the banking system, give the government more control over monetary policy. Blah, 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 right? After collecting it, the government raises the official price of gold, which means the dollar is effectively devalued. Sound familiar? This is why Fort Knox suddenly matters a lot more. After World War II, global leaders build a new monetary system. The US dollar is tied to gold internationally. Other currencies are tied to the dollar. By the late 1960s, other countries start redeeming US dollars for gold. In 1971, President Nixon closes the quote-unquote gold window. Temporarily, he says, but as we know, it became permanent. And boom, modern fiat money era. Inflation explodes in the 1970s. The Federal Reserve gains more prominence managing crises through interest rates and liquidity. Then fast forward to 2008, we get the infamous, financial crisis, massive bailouts. Then fast forward again to COVID. Trillions are magically created to just stabilize the economy. And every time that happens, gold prices jump and panic spikes. Okay, history lesson over. You're welcome. Now that we have the ingredients, gold seizures, vaults, presidents making emergency announcements, money no longer tied to metal, central bankers moving markets, and modern crises, and mixing those with fear, inflation, and the internet, you get conspiracies, which means it's finally time. All right, so now that we've sprinted through a century of monetary chaos, this is the part of the episode where the lights get low, the cork comes out of the bottle, and the internet comes out to play. Because whenever you combine money, fear, powerful institutions, secrecy, government, emergency powers, and systems so complicated that people can't even fully explain them, you don't get calm policy debates. You get conspiracy ecosystems, full cinematic universes, spin-offs, lore, social media prophets, YouTube analysts with very dramatic lighting, people in comment sections saying things like, just watch, they don't want you to know, screenshot this, which is always how the most credible information begins. Take that as you will. So let's start with the shadow banking elites and the quote-unquote they problem. One of the most common threads in this genre is the idea that a tiny group of ultra-wealthy families secretly control the global financial system. Banking dynasties, old money, invisible hands behind every crash, boom, and bailout. The names change depending on which corner of the internet you wander into, but the story structure stays the same. There's a hidden group, they operate above governments, they manipulate currencies, they benefit from crises, and they know what's coming. And they are the reason you're stressed about groceries. Now, here's where I always pause, because historically, yes, wealthy families existed, definitely, especially in the banking industry. Yes, financiers have had massive influence over governments. Yes, big institutions lobby, and yes, corruption happens, right? That part is not fiction. But the conspiracy version flattens insanely complex global systems into a single villain with a master plan and a group chat. And that simplification is It's psychologically comforting, terrifying, but comforting, because random systems failing is honestly scarier than believing someone is steering the ship. Humans hate chaos. We would rather believe in an evil mastermind than admit that thousands of interacting policies, incentives, mistakes, political pressures, and unforeseen events collide at once. A shadowy cabal at least makes the plot understandable. And just like that, we are circling back to our girl Fort Knox. This is where people zoom in on grainy photos of gold bars like it's a Zapruder film. They ask, why don't they let journalists in more often? Why isn't it audited constantly? Why can't we live stream the vault? That's a valid one. And why is it always politicians touring and not like, random accountants named Greg, right? There are spreadsheets, serial number breakdowns, maps, claims that the gold was secretly leased out, moved overseas, swapped, or even replaced with tungsten bars coated in gold, like we talked about, which is my favorite genre of the theory because the engineering explanation is always extremely specific and delivered with supreme confidence. And again, psychologically, secrecy plus high stakes equals imagination on steroids. A locked vault that symbolizes national wealth is never going to be emotionally neutral. It's always going to attract suspicion, especially in eras where people already feel like institutions are just straight up lying to them. All right, next up is the return to gold fantasy. This is the recurring theme that governments are secretly preparing to go back to gold backed money, that a new currency is waiting in the wings, that digital dollars will be backed by metal, and that central banks are hoarding bullion because they know fiat is about to collapse. You'll see the charts of gold purchases, dramatic arrows, capital letters, quote unquote, this proves it. And to be fair, central banks do buy gold. That's public information. But in conspiracy land, every purchase becomes evidence of an imminent monetary apocalypse. The appeal here is emotional. Gold is tangible. It feels safe. It feels ancient. It feels like something you could physically hold while everything else melts, unless it's too hot. Then, of course, the gold will melt. Which it's exactly why it stars in so many end of the world fantasies. And speaking of the end of the world, which we do enjoy doing on this show, we also have the people who don't even care about global elites. We're talking about prepper culture and backyard vault energy. These people are like, I don't know who's running things, and frankly, I don't want to. I just want to be ready when the ATM stops working. And listen, preparing for emergencies is not inherently unhinged. We've already discussed the importance and legitimacy of doing so on this podcast before. But the internet version always escalates. Suddenly it's grid failures, hyperinflation, global resets, secret summits, blackouts, digital wallets being frozen. And whether you see that as a possible reality or unnecessary dramatic escalation, that's up to you. So now let's briefly touch on the psychology behind it all. Why this stuff spreads. Because money is not abstract emotionally. Money equals food, rent, safety, medicine, status, future plans, and much more, obviously. So when economic headlines start sounding scary, your brain flips into ancient mammal mode. Scarcity, threat, loss of control. And conspiracy theories, they live in that environment. They offer villains, simple narratives, secret knowledge, community, a sense of being ahead of the collapse. So people who are just casually checking inflation numbers are suddenly 3 hours deep into a video titled "The Reset is Coming and Here's the Date." Honestly, we're all just doing our best. So no matter how you personally handle it, just remember that we're all in it together, right? Okay, so now we've arrived at the grand finale of monetary conspiracy lore, the one that ties everything together into a single cinematic arc, the global reset, everyone's favorite, the one world government. So, depending on the version, this theory says that world governments, central banks, international organizations, tech companies, elites, take your pick, are secretly coordinating to collapse existing currencies and replace them with a new system, introduce digital money, like fully digital money, by eliminating cash, centralize power, erase debt for some, and destroy savings for others, and create a one world financial order where normal people are permanently controlled through programmable money. Whew, that was a mouthful, but we're not done. There are countdown clocks, leaked document claims, summit photos analyzed like crime scenes, acronyms, so many acronyms, and charts showing arrows pointing toward the apocalypse. And every market wobble becomes, that's it. Every bank failure becomes they're testing the system. Every new digital payment platform becomes proof, right? And this is where it gets interesting because what makes this series so powerful isn't just the claim itself, it's that it absorbs everything. Inflation fits, central banks buying gold fits, wars destabilizing regions that tracks, digital currencies being discussed publicly fits, closed door international meetings also fits. It's a narrative framework that can swallow basically any unsettling headline and slot it neatly into a larger story, which is why it spreads, which is why people argue about it, why entire online communities form around, tracking its quote unquote signals. And that's where I like to pause, not to dismiss it and certainly not to mock it, just to slow things down a bit. I mean, y'all know how I feel about a good conspiracy. Now, let's get to what I think because I actually get why this one grabs people. Hell, it grabs me. Like, I like conspiracies. That's literally why we're here. I'm open to the idea that powerful institutions exist, that governments don't tell us everything, that money systems are political, and that history is full of things that we only learn decades later. That part, true, 100%. So when people start connecting dots between central banks buying gold, governments talking about digital currencies, inflation spiking, wars destabilizing regions, and closed door international meetings, I understand why some people are like, okay, like that feels like more than a coincidence. And I think it's healthy to question systems that literally run your entire life. It's rational to side eye power and, notice patterns. Where I personally slow my roll is at the scale and the coordination that's being implied. Because the strongest versions of this theory require a level of global synchronization that is extremely impressive, to say the least. Like, we can't coordinate international climate policy or airline baggage rules, but we can orchestrate a flawless worldwide monetary reset in total secrecy. Come on. I don't know. It definitely could be possible if it were all managed by like a private institution or institutions. We know how the government and bureaucrats take forever to get anything done. So, hey, it could very well be the case. But you can't tell me that the thought hasn't crossed your mind that a few elites, governments, or private sectors might be pulling a lot of the strings. Because if they're not, then the alternative is that the entire system is fragile, very chaotic, and hanging on by a thread with no one fully in charge. And honestly, that's not exactly comforting either. However, and I really do try to see both sides of the coin, that kind of operation would leave fingerprints, paper trails, leaks, documents, insiders talking, something. And that doesn't mean nothing shady ever happens. History proves that it absolutely does. It just means I like separating, what we can document, what's plausible but unproven, what's speculative, and what's straight up internet prophecy. But the emotional core of these theories, that makes complete sense to me because they take a messy, stressful, opaque system and turn it into a single storyline. They give chaos a shape and they make people feel like they're not crazy for being uneasy about inflation, digital money, or how much power central banks really have over us. And honestly, that instinct, to question who controls the system is not in any way irrational. It's human. And here's the other thing I keep circling back to: gold. Because if everything really does go sideways, what exactly are we fucking doing with it? You can't eat it. You can't drink it. You certainly can't grow crops with it. You can't patch a roof with it. Are you shaving flakes into soup? Trading dust for bread? Are we making bullets out of it? Because I don't think gold is particularly an aerodynamic weapon, right? Like in full collapse mode, canned goods are having a phenomenal year compared to bullion. But with all that said, it doesn't mean that gold is useless. Historically, in unstable economies, people do fall back on hard assets. Precious metals have held value across cultures and centuries. They're portable, recognizable, divisible. You can melt them down. That all is very real. But sometimes gold gets treated like a magical talisman, like stack enough bars in a safe and reality just, it can't touch you. But I'm not sure any object should get that kind of power, right? Please agree with me here. Which is why I try emphasis on try to stay in the middle lane, although I obviously lean more on the conspiracy side. But I try to remain, curious, skeptical, open minded, and paying attention. And of course, deciding for myself how far down the rabbit hole I want to go, because I've gone down pretty deep here, people, trust me. All right, now I've told you where I land, and now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you trust the Federal Reserve, the Fed? Do you think governments hide more about financial systems than they admit? I sure do. Do you think we're headed toward full digital money, like completely fully digital, no more dollars, no more coins? Would you feel safer if currency were backed by gold again? Can I get an amen? Do you think Fort Knox has exactly what they say it has? So, we've covered gold, vaults, central banks, resets, and the existential dread of realizing your bank balance is basically a social agreement. If this episode made you think or spiral or immediately text someone asking if they've ever thought about how money isn't real, my work here is done. All right, well, that's it for today, but thank you so much for hanging out with me. Before you go, if you're not subscribed to the After Hours newsletter, you are missing out. Every Friday, you'll get a quick episode recap, the quote of the week, a confession from a fellow listener, my personal takeaway from the episode, and of course, the wine behind it all. Speaking of confessions, if you've got one, we want to hear it. It could be a conspiracy you low-key believe, an embarrassing story, or a hot take about literally anything. Whatever it is, we want it, so submit away. You can also pitch episode ideas. So if you've got something you want us to talk about, we are all ears. You can do all of these wonderful things by visiting our website at winenotpod.com. And if you love the show, leave us a review. It really does help more than you think. All right, well, thank you again so much for joining me, and I will see you next week for another wild ride. Bye.